Walk into a restaurant in Manhattan or London tonight and order a dozen oysters, and depending on the provenance stamped on the menu, you could be handing over $200 before the wine even arrives. Kumamoto from a single bay in Japan. Bilon from one river mouth in Brittany. Each shell placed on crushed ice like a tiny jewel box. Served with a mignonette sauce and a sommelier's earnest explanation of Merah, the oceanic answer to a wine's terroir. This is food as theatre, food as status, food that announces to everyone at the table that you have arrived. Now consider this. A little over a century ago, the exact same animal was so cheap, so overwhelmingly abundant, that it was ladled out to prisoners in New York jails, stuffed into the rations of enslaved workers on southern plantations, and sold from filthy street carts for pennies to anyone who could scrape together the coin. Oysters were not a delicacy. They were a filler food, a stomach stretcher, the 18th and 19th century equivalent of a bag of chips. Sailors grumbled about eating them too often. Servants negotiated contracts capping how many times a week their employers could serve them oysters, the way a modern office worker might negotiate against being fed cafeteria meatloaf 5 days running. So how exactly did a food once considered so lowly that convicts ate it involuntarily become a food that the wealthy now pay a small fortune to eat voluntarily? How did something scraped off rocks by the barrelful become something flown across continents in single-layer crates, numbered and dated like fine art? The answer involves ancient Roman engineers who figured out how to farm the ocean floor. A persistent and largely unsupported rumor about seduction that made a Venetian womanizer famous. A public health disaster that quietly poisoned entire cities. And a marketing reinvention so complete that it rewired what an entire culture believes about scarcity, taste, and worth. This is the strange, briny, occasionally scandalous journey of the oyster, from convict ration to caviar tier luxury, and it is far stranger than the shell on your plate would ever let on. To understand how the oyster became a battleground between the gutter and the palace, you have to go back long before Rome, before money, before written history even had a word for luxury. Archaeologists have found towering mounds of discarded oyster shells, known as middens, along coastlines on nearly every continent, some stretching back over 10,000 years and piling up higher than a 2-story building. These were not decorative. They were the trash heaps of people who ate oysters constantly, day after day, generation after generation, because oysters were reliable, abundant, and did not require a spear, a net, or a stroke of luck to catch. You simply walked to the shoreline at low tide and pried them off the rocks. Indigenous coastal communities across the world built entire seasonal economies and, in some cases, permanent settlements around these shellfish beds, treating them less like a delicacy and more like infrastructure. A dependable source of protein that freed up time and energy for everything else a society needed to do. There was no white tablecloth involved. There was just the tide, the rocks, and the shell knife. And yet, even in this ancient world, a strange duality was already forming, because while oysters fed the many, they also began to symbolize something else entirely, once civilizations developed the concept of status. Enter Rome. A society with an almost pathological talent for turning the ordinary into the aspirational. Roman writers documented oysters being transported inland, packed and preserved for the wealthy tables of citizens who lived nowhere near a coast, because eating something perishable and far-flung was, then as now, a way of announcing your money to the room. But the real innovation came from Roman engineering, which figured out that instead of waiting for nature to grow oysters, you could cultivate them, controlling their environment to produce them faster and more predictably. This shift from foraging to farming was quietly revolutionary. It meant the oyster stopped being purely a gift of the tide and started being a product of human labor and design, something that could be scaled, branded, and sold as a mark of sophistication to Roman elites, who prized them not only for taste, but for their supposed associations with fertility and desire. So even in antiquity, the oyster was living a double life: shoreline staple for the poor who could gather them for free, and refined status symbol for the wealthy who wanted them shipped, farmed, and served with ceremony. That tension between abundance and exclusivity, between the shell heap and the banquet table, is the thread that will run through every century of this story. And it is about to collide head-on with one of the most persistent myths in culinary history. So let's talk about the myth, because you have almost certainly heard it. Oysters make you fall into bed faster than a bottle of wine ever could. The legend of the oyster as nature's guaranteed aphrodisiac is one of the oldest food myths still in active circulation, whispered in seafood restaurants, and printed on menus that charge extra for the implication. The story usually gets attached to famous seducers and hedonists of history, larger-than-life figures whose reputations for romantic conquest supposedly ran on a steady diet of raw shellfish. It's a great story. It photographs well. It sells a lot of oysters. It is also, according to the actual scientific and historical record, mostly folklore dressed up as fact. Here is what is real. Oysters are, without question, extraordinarily high in zinc, a mineral that plays a genuine role in testosterone production and reproductive health. That much checks out biologically. But here is the part the legend conveniently skips. Having adequate zinc in your diet does not function like a light switch for desire. The human body does not work on a hydraulic system where one dinner triggers an immediate measurable surge in libido a few hours later at the table. Nutritional science is clear that zinc deficiency can suppress reproductive function over time, which is a very different claim than saying a plate of 6 oysters on ice is going to transform your evening. One is slow, cumulative biology. The other is marketing. And that gap between the modest, unglamorous truth and the seductive legend is where centuries of folklore quietly moved in and set up shop. Why did the myth attach itself so firmly to oysters specifically, rather than to, say, spinach or beans, which are also zinc-rich? Partly texture, partly presentation, and partly the simple fact that oysters have always carried an air of sensuality, slippery, glistening, served cold and eaten with the fingers, an experience that lends itself to innuendo, regardless of what's happening at the cellular level. Add centuries of associating oysters with Venus, with fertility rites, with the coastal cultures that first prized them, and you have a myth with deep enough roots that no amount of laboratory data was ever going to fully dislodge it. None of this is to say the fascination was manufactured out of nothing. Humans have always been drawn to foods that feel indulgent, rare, and a little bit illicit, and oysters checked every box. But the science tells a more modest story than the legend does. A genuinely nutritious food, rich in a mineral connected to reproductive health, wrapped in centuries of romantic exaggeration that had far more to do with theatre than with biochemistry, which is, in its own way, a preview of everything still to come in this story, because the oyster's reputation, again and again, would turn out to be built less on what it actually did and more on what people needed it to represent. Then came the age of empire, and with it, an accident of geography that would turn the oyster from Roman delicacy into the fuel of an entire continent's appetite. When European ships crossed the Atlantic and began charting the coastlines of what would become the eastern United States, they found oyster beds on a scale nothing in the Old World had prepared them for. Chesapeake Bay alone held reefs so vast and so dense that early accounts described them as navigation hazards, mounds of shell rising close enough to the surface to threaten a ship's hull. This was not a delicacy trickling in from distant farms. This was an ecological windfall, practically inexhaustible, sitting right at the doorstep of every port town being built along the coast, and colonial settlers, whatever else they lacked, did not lack the sense to exploit it. Oyster harvesting required no elaborate infrastructure, no plows, no seed, no waiting season after season for a crop to mature. You went out with a rake or a tongs, pulled them up by the bushel, and had dinner. That simplicity is what turned the oyster into the food of first resort for coastal communities. And it is what set the stage for the industry that followed, because a resource that abundant and that easy to harvest was never going to stay a local curiosity for long. It was going to become a business. And a chaotic one. By the early 19th century, New York Harbor had become the beating heart of that business, its waters so thick with natural oyster beds that some historians estimate they held roughly half the world's oysters at the time. Out of that abundance grew an entire subculture of consumption, unlike anything before it. The oyster cellar. Picture a cramped basement room beneath a Manhattan street, lit by oil lamps, smelling of brine and sawdust, packed with dockworkers, clerks, and merchants, all shoulder to shoulder at long communal tables. For a few cents, a patron could eat their fill, sometimes literally, at all-you-can-eat prices that would be unthinkable for any seafood today. Above ground, pushcart vendors worked the streets shucking oysters to order, selling them by the dozen to anyone walking by with a coin in hand. No reservation, no tablecloth, no pretense. This was democratic eating in its purest form. A banker and a bricklayer might crouch at the same cart, slurping from the same barrel, because the oyster did not discriminate by class, and neither did the price. Restaurants served them by the barrel load as an appetizer, simply to keep customers occupied while the kitchen prepared the real meal, the seafood equivalent of a breadbasket. Saloons gave them away free, with a beer to draw in drinkers, banking on the fact that salty oysters would only make men thirstier. The sheer volume moving through these markets was staggering, with New York alone shipping hundreds of millions of oysters a year at the industry's peak, packed in barrels and sent inland by rail and canal to cities that had never seen a coastline. For a brief, glittering stretch of the 19th century, the oyster was not rare. It was everywhere. And that omnipresence is exactly what set the stage for its strangest chapter yet. Because when a food becomes this cheap, this available, and this filling, it does not stay confined to saloons and street carts. It ends up on the tables of people who have no say in what they eat at all. Consider, for a moment, the diet of a 19th-century American prison inmate or an indentured servant fresh off a boat from Europe. These were not people with bargaining power. Their meals were decided for them, dictated by cost, availability, and the bare minimum required to keep a body working. And in that grim calculus, oysters were not a treat. They were filler. Cheaper than beef, cheaper than pork, cheaper in some port cities than bread itself, oysters became the default protein for people society had decided did not deserve a choice. Servant contracts in the colonies and early republic sometimes spelled this out with startling specificity, including clauses that limited how often masters could serve oysters to their indentured workers, capping the meals at a handful of times per week. Read that again. The complaint was not that servants were being denied oysters. It was that they were drowning in them. The same shellfish, now presented tableside with a flourish of mignonette sauce, was, for these workers, a monotonous, unglamorous obligation, so relentless that legal limits had to be written down to prevent masters from serving nothing else. Prisons followed the same logic. Institutional records from the era describe oysters appearing on inmate menus with a regularity that would seem absurd by today's standards, not as a reward, but as the cheapest possible way to deliver calories and protein to a captive population. Nobody was rewarding prisoners with delicacy. They were feeding them the least expensive thing available in bulk and in coastal cities. That thing happened to be the oyster. Sailors and dock workers told a similar story. Ship provisions and waterfront boarding houses leaned on oysters precisely because they were local, durable, and dirt cheap to acquire in volume, requiring no refrigeration beyond a cool barrel and no preparation beyond a knife and a strong wrist. For the men hauling cargo or standing watch through freezing harbor nights, oysters were sustenance, not sophistication, a food valued for its abundance rather than its flavor profile. There is a particular irony sitting inside all of this that deserves a moment of attention. The same qualities that make oysters marketable as a luxury today. Their briny distinctiveness, their variation from bed to bed, their sheer specificity of place, meant nothing to a 19th-century warden or shipowner. To them, an oyster was an oyster, a unit of cheap protein to be measured in barrels and shoveled onto plates, indistinguishable from the next. The idea that anyone would pay a premium for a particular reef's terroir would have struck a prison cook as an elaborate joke. And yet this workhorse status is precisely what cemented the oyster's reputation as the great equalizer of American and British diets. A food so fundamentally unglamorous in its everyday form that entire institutions built rules around not overserving it. That reputation would not last. The very abundance that made oysters prisoner food and servant fare was already, quietly, eating itself alive beneath the water's surface, and the collapse that followed would rewrite everything this food had ever meant. Okay, let's pause here for a second, because if you're anything like us, your entire mental model of the oyster just got turned upside down. A prison food, a servant's ration written into legal contracts specifically to cap how often someone could eat it. That is not the story printed on the menu at a raw bar charging you $8 apiece. And we are only halfway through this thing. If you're finding this rewiring of a food's entire social history as satisfying as we do, this is the part where we ask you to hit subscribe, because the story is about to take a much darker turn. What you have heard so far is a story of abundance, of a coastline so thick with shellfish that it seemed inexhaustible, a resource so cheap it insulted the very idea of luxury. That part of the story is, in a strange way, the good news. What comes next is not. Beneath the docks and oyster cellars and pushcarts, something was going catastrophically wrong, and almost nobody noticed until it was too late to stop it. The reefs that once rose high enough to threaten ships were being stripped bare by dredges dragging steel teeth across the harbor floor, faster than any oyster population could regenerate. The same rivers that fed those beds with nutrients were also, increasingly, the dumping ground for a rapidly industrializing society's sewage, chemical runoff, and waste, and oysters, as it turns out, are filter feeders. which means they do not just sit passively in the water. They actively pull it through their bodies, gallons of it a day, concentrating whatever is floating in it, including the pathogens flowing straight out of city sewer pipes. Nobody designing those disposal systems in the 1880s and 1890s was thinking about the shellfish downstream. Why would they? Oysters were prisoner food. Nobody put much thought into prisoner food. That indifference was about to collide head-on with public health, and the resulting scandal would nearly kill the American oyster industry outright, exposing a hidden danger that had been sitting quietly on dinner plates for decades. We are talking typhoid outbreaks. We are talking cities banning oyster sales overnight. We are talking about the moment this cheap, democratic, working-class staple became something people were suddenly, viscerally afraid to put in their mouths. And out of that fear, that collapse, that public health catastrophe, an entirely different kind of oyster industry would eventually emerge, one built not on abundance, but on scarcity, not on quantity, but on curated, branded, almost aristocratic exclusivity. The oyster was about to die one identity and be reborn as another entirely. Stick around, because the transformation from convict ration to $200 tasting menu runs directly through a public health disaster that the industry spent the better part of a century trying to make everyone forget. The collapse did not happen all at once. It happened the way most collapses happen, which is to say gradually, then suddenly, then with a formal government announcement that made it official. Chesapeake Bay, once so thick with reefs that ship captains logged them as navigation hazards, saw its harvest volumes crater as dredging boats scraped the bottom clean year after year, giving the oysters no chance to rebuild the reef structure they needed to reproduce. New York Harbor followed the same trajectory. The half of the world's oyster supply that had once come pouring out of those waters began drying up as the beds were stripped faster than nature could replenish them. And it was not only overharvesting doing the damage. The rivers feeding those beds were now carrying the runoff of an industrializing nation, sewage, chemical waste, the byproducts of cities that had exploded in population without any corresponding investment in how to dispose of what all those people left behind. Oysters, being filter feeders, do exactly what their name suggests. They pull water through their bodies constantly, and whatever is suspended in that water, bacteria, heavy metals, human waste, gets concentrated inside their tissue. For centuries, this biological fact had been irrelevant, because the water was relatively clean. By the turn of the 20th century, it was no longer irrelevant. It was a public health time bomb sitting on plates in oyster cellars from Boston to Baltimore. The bomb went off in the form of typhoid fever. Outbreaks traced directly back to contaminated oyster beds started appearing in cities across the country, and public health officials, for the first time, began systematically investigating what exactly was living inside America's favorite cheap protein. The findings were not reassuring. Sewage-tainted beds near urban centers were producing oysters that carried the same bacteria responsible for the outbreaks sickening entire neighborhoods. This was not a rumor or a moral panic. It was documented, traceable, and terrifying to a public that had eaten oysters by the barrel without a second thought for generations. Cities responded the only way they could, by banning sales outright, shutting down the cellars and pushcarts that had defined urban food culture for the better part of a century. The industry's reputation, built on abundance and cheapness, collapsed almost as fast as the reefs themselves had. Sales plummeted. Consumer trust evaporated. An entire class of oystermen, from Chesapeake Tongers to New York Shuckers, watched their livelihoods disappear practically overnight because of what was, quite literally, invisible in the water. The public health investigators and sanitary engineers who exposed the contamination were not household names. They were bureaucrats and scientists doing unglamorous water testing work. But their findings did something no marketing campaign ever could have. They forced an entire industry to confront the fact that its core product, sold for a century as cheap, safe, endlessly abundant nourishment for prisoners and paupers alike, had quietly become a vector for disease. The oyster's democratic era was over. What replaced it would look nothing like the oyster cellar. So how do you rebuild an industry after you have poisoned the public's trust in it? You do not go back to abundance. You go the other direction entirely, and you make scarcity itself the selling point. In the decades following the Typhoid scandal, governments stepped in with a level of oversight the oyster trade had never seen before, mandating water quality testing, sanitary certification, and inspection regimes for harvesting grounds that had previously answered to no one but the tide. Wild reefs, already devastated by a century of unregulated dredging, were in no condition to supply the old volumes even if the public had still wanted them at that scale, and regulators were not about to let contaminated beds reopen without proof of safety. That proof took time, capital, and infrastructure, three things the old pushcart economy never required and never had. What filled the gap was aquaculture, the deliberate farming of oysters in controlled, monitored conditions, rather than the free-for-all dredging of wild reefs. Cultivated beds could be tested, tracked, and certified in ways a wild harvest never could, which meant farmed oysters became the only kind regulators and increasingly consumers were willing to trust. This is the quiet mechanical heart of the entire transformation, and it deserves a moment of attention because it explains everything that follows. Safety regulation did not just clean up the oyster, it fundamentally changed who could afford to sell one. Farming oysters meant leases, equipment, years of cultivation before a single one reached maturity, and constant water monitoring, an entirely different cost structure than a tonga with a rake and a rowboat. The cheap, chaotic, anyone-can-do-it industry of the 19th century was replaced by a smaller number of operators with the capital to meet the new standards, and a smaller supply. Sold to a public still wary from the scandal meant one thing above all others: prices went up. And once prices went up, the marketing followed, because a product that used to define cheapness needed an entirely new story to justify its new cost. That story borrowed, quite deliberately, from wine. Restaurants and growers began labeling oysters not as an undifferentiated commodity, the way they had been sold by the barrel to prisons and pushcarts, but by specific origin, a particular bay, a particular farm, a particular stretch of coastline, each claiming a distinct flavor shaped by its local water. This is, functionally, the same appellation logic that turns a bottle of wine from fermented grape juice into a product of terroir. And it worked on oysters just as well as it had on Bordeaux. Suddenly a diner was not just eating an oyster, they were tasting a place, a story, a pedigree. High-end restaurants built entire menus around raw bars and tasting flights, treating oyster selection with the vocabulary once reserved for sommeliers: brininess, minerality, finish, the very qualities that had made oysters dangerous. Their status as filter feeders, soaking up whatever surrounded them, were rebranded as the source of their sophistication, proof that the water itself had character worth paying for. What began as a public health necessity, regulation forcing farmed traceability onto a discredited industry, ended as a branding triumph, turning traceability into prestige. The oyster had not become rarer by accident. It had been made rare, then made luxurious, by the very forces that once nearly killed it off entirely. So picture that white tablecloth again. The one from the very beginning of this story, the raw bar with its bed of crushed ice, its tiny forks, its handwritten menu naming a bay and a farm the way a wine list names a vineyard. 12 oysters, $200, and a waiter who can tell you not just what species you are eating, but where it grew, as though the oyster itself has a resume. Now hold that image next to the other one. A basement room in 19th century New York, sawdust on the floor, a nickel in your palm. Eat as many as you can before the bucket runs dry. Hold it next to a prison mess hall where the cooks serve oysters, because oysters are the cheapest thing on the dock, not the finest. Hold it next to a servant's contract, with a clause specifically written to stop a master from feeding his help oysters more than a few times a week. Not out of cruelty, but because oysters were so abundant that without a limit, they would be served constantly. That is the same animal. That is the same food. Nothing about the oyster itself changed. What changed was everything around it. The reefs stripped bare by dredges that took more than the water could ever regrow. The rivers turned into sewers that poisoned the last of the wild beds. The outbreaks that emptied the trust people once placed in a food they had eaten without a second thought for generations. Scarcity did what abundance never could. It gave the oyster a story worth paying for. Regulation forced the industry into farms and leases and water testing, and farming turned a free-for-all harvest into a controlled, expensive, patient craft. And that craft turned naturally into branding, and branding turned a filter-feeding mollusk into something you discuss with the same reverence as a vintage. The irony sits right at the center of the plate. The very qualities that once made oysters a public health liability, cheap, plentiful, indiscriminately harvested from anywhere the tide reached, are the exact qualities that had to be eliminated for oysters to become a luxury at all. You cannot charge $200 for something everyone can afford. So the world made sure, through collapse, scandal, and reinvention, that hardly anyone could afford it. Think about that the next time someone tells you an oyster tastes like the ocean. It once did, quite literally, and that was the problem. Now it tastes like scarcity, dressed up as sophistication, served with a squeeze of lemon and a story about provenance. The prisoners eating them out of necessity and the financiers eating them out of status are separated by little more than 100 years and an entire architecture of manufactured rarity. If you want the short version, here it is. History did not make the oyster better. History just made it rarer. And rarity is the only ingredient the rich have ever really been willing to pay for.